with this video, we're going to continue on the theme of international connections that the Mycenaeans and, to a certain extent, the Minoans had during the late Bronze Age. And I want to look at a couple shipwrecks off the southern coast of Turkey. Now, the father of underwater archaeology is this gentleman, George Bass. He went to school with my teachers, actually, and he pioneered this field. And he's done several excavations. We can see the top right with, something Egyptian there. On the lower left, it looks like a medieval ship there. On the bottom right, we see stacks of pottery that, as I'll show you, are used as ballast on boats. And this is really exciting. I remember when this was announced. It was the summer before I was starting graduate school, so that was summer of '83. And I remember George Bass sitting with this guy Jamal Polak. I'll show you a Turkish guy, Jamal, who I'll show you in a moment. And I remember the announcement. They just showed those two sitting on a beach. George Bass says to Jamal, "We have a lifetime of dissertations here." And he was right. This is one of the biggest discoveries in my field. It's up there with the terracotta warriors of Xi'an for Chinese archaeology and King Tut for Egyptian archaeology, because this shipwreck is what's called a closed deposit. That is to say, it's only one period. It's not like a multi-layered site, inhabitation site. And he learned how to scuba dive to excavate these. So we can see some of the methods used here in the center, where they use these measuring squares in order to lay out a grid for labeling during excavation and photography. Upper left, you can see a boat there that shows all the pottery, still maintains the shape of the ship. The wood has disappeared, but all the amphorae and other vessels are there. And some more stuff that's underwater. Now, this shipwreck is called either the Kaş shipwreck or the Uluburun shipwreck. It's right in the pretty almost the center of the slide, a little bit off to the right center, on the southern coast of Anatolia. And what was found in this boat were finds from Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, and Mycenaean Greece. So we don't know the origins of the boat, but we believe that it was a sort of international group of traders. And we can see that they had different ingots and pottery and anchors that showed, where the goods came from. Interestingly enough, anchors are very regionally specific because, they're heavy and you got to carve them out of some stone, and it's not like they're mold made with like a metal sword where you pour the molten, the metal, the liquid metal into a mold and it dries. These have to be chiseled out, and they require a lot of work. And so at different places they were made somewhat differently, as I'll show you later on. Here's just another a map to show this, the route again. The excavator, George Bass, thinks they were going counterclockwise in their route. But what's important here is to notice that, even though they're just, when they go to Egypt, they're just at the delta to the north, they're getting products from the south there. Specifically, we'll see elephant tusks coming from the south, and then also stuff from Mesopotamia. But this was found in the Mediterranean. So these are, it's picking up stuff from long-distance trade routes and taking it around. Here's a very famous picture where they found a gold sword, just to give you an idea of just how spectacular the finds were from this site. And I'm going to show you some of them as we go through it. This was happening right, as I said, I just started graduate school and the excavations were happening, and even had a friend or colleague who was on it, somebody I knew. Here we see the shape of we get the distribution of the finds on the boat. And you can see it sort of has the general shape of the boat, at least the top part of it. The bottom part, there was a ledge on the bottom of the ocean, and it just sunk and went away. It just got washed away. So we just have this one side of the boat, and we can see clear in this slide how the distribution of the ingots and other goods. Now, remember, these ingots are these really heavy pieces of metal that were used for mass storage of metal. And this boat had a king's ransom full of ingots of bronze and even a tin ingot and glass ingots and other just amazing things that I'm going to show you. And this, site is, as I said, was discovered this summer before I started graduate school in '83, and there's still talks at the meetings that I attend where people are still publishing some of the finds from this site. It's so exciting. Here's a reconstruction of the boat. To give you an idea of they could put the ingots on one side at the bottom and then pottery vessels on the other side. And they use it as ballast. That is to say, you have the heaviest things on the boat at the very bottom, on the right above the keel, and it helps to prevent the boat from tipping over. And here we have just a reconstruction of it, of where especially on the bottom, where the water level was coming up to approximately. The one thing that's interesting about this slide, and I'll come back to this idea, is you see that guy in the blue clothing there. Well, those are Mycenaean clothes. The guys to the left are Egyptian. The guy with the long robe to the right is probably Syrian. So it's an international crowd. And when you go to the Uluburun Museum, they have this nice display to give you a good feel for the shipwreck. I should say the Kosh or the museum is not exactly at the site. Put it that way. It's in a nearby city. But in any case, that gives you a nice reconstruction of and with the cutouts of the people, you get an idea of the size. Here's the very famous cover from National Geo, where this diver is picking up an ingot. And we've seen those oxhide ingots before. Remember the ones with the handles on all four corners. But notice stuck to the bottom to it, encrusted to the bottom, is what's called a bun ingot. It's a round-shaped ingot, like a round loaf of bread or a bun, and hence its name. So it was carrying a bunch of raw materials, amongst other things, in this site. And here is another shot of it. And you can see we get the general outline of the boat, and then there is that big anchor in front that's sort of fallen away. But the ingots themselves have maintained the shape of the boat, even though the wood hasn't completely disappeared, but for the most part. And here is just a really good example of how many there were. And this was lined up along the bottom side of the boat, once again, to give it ballast. I've seen these. Well, I saw these ingots when they were being conserved, because they had to stay in water. Once they were taken out of the salt water, they had to be put into fresh water and kept there for many years, actually, to drain the salts out from the ingot, because if they don't, it would cause the ingots to disintegrate. And you can see just how many ingots. And all these ingots are really heavy as well. So it was a king's fortune that was lost with the sinking of this boat. Here's another shot of the ingots. And you can see that man standing on top of them, and he's lifted out a pottery, some sort of vessel, ceramic vessel. And the carefulness of this excavation is amazing. I'll come back to in a moment just, how deep this is, but it's like 120 meters deep, this site. So it's pretty spectacular. Here we have another shot of a gentleman, well, it could be a lady, I really don't know, picking up a pithos. That's one of those big jars with the smaller endings on the bottom. We saw these for example, at Knossos. We saw a lot of them. And this is being wrapped in a net and being lifted up. So these are like 120 meters down. And scuba divers tell me that's really, really, really far. And it would take them something like 20 minutes to get down to the site, and then 20 minutes to decompress coming up. And they could only work on at the site for like 5 minutes at a time, because apparently at that depth, you start getting sort of dizzy. As George Bass famously said in all of his talks that I saw, or most of them, is that it was like having a couple martinis when you were down there, because that's just how deep it is, and so they wouldn't have much time to do individually things. So the excavation as a team, took years. It was really amazing. And here are some of the ingots, as I mentioned, that were found. These oxhide shapes gives you an idea of the size of these. And once again, the size does not betray just how heavy these are. And here's another ingot upon which some other metal things are laying. We see these swords on the left, on the ingot. The longer of the two is an interesting one I'll come back to in the next lecture, called a Naue Type 2 sword. And I'll explain why that's so important. To the right of that is this golden strigil. Now, a strigil is something you use for cleaning yourself. What the ancients did was they would rub olive oil onto their skin, and then they would take this strigil, and it was sort of, hoop-shaped, or arched, I should say, and scrape it against their skin, and that would lift the dirt out of the pores of the skin and leave the skin quite soft due to the olive oil. We knew they had used these in the past. I mean, we knew that in the past we knew that they'd been used, but not till later periods. I think this is the earliest one that might have ever been found. We'll see when we get to like the 5th century, they're quite common. And we see some spearheads, another strigil, and then some axes on the bottom. So the excavation, or the boat, was full of metals. And there is Jamal on the left with the older guy, George Bass, is from a couple decades ago, and from the National Geo, and it shows them studying a pot. His talks on this were so exciting because every year it was like they were producing new stuff. And here we see some of those ingots that these two women are holding. This one's a lot larger than the ones I showed you before, giving you an idea of just how heavy they are. Also was found for the first time were glass ingots. We didn't know how glass was transported in bulk, and quite frankly, we don't have much glass from this period, this early on. But they have this cobalt blue, which we believe shows an Egyptian origin. And what they did is, they would get the glass sort of soft, overheat, but not so soft that it would melt, but soft enough that they could break off a portion of this ingot, this bun-shaped ingot, and melt it down and make whatever they wanted to make. So this was for mass transportation. And so they're really exciting, and there were many of them found because glass was so important, apparently. Unfortunately, as I said, not much has been preserved for us from these earlier phases. Later phases, especially the Romans, we have tons of glass. It just didn't make it that, it didn't preserve for us for some reason from these earlier phases. And then we have anchors. And here's this anchor here, and on the left is leading on top of are two ingots, and then there's another pottery vessel to the upper right, and then part of an ingot at the very top, cut off by the top of the frame. And what's interesting about these anchors is that, as I said, they're regionally different. And so there was different types of anchors, and they would pick them up and apparently would trade them and use them as ballast as well. But so unfortunately, they had a couple of different types, so that doesn't help us where the boat originated. And once again, it had finds from all over the Eastern Mediterranean. So, it's hard to pin down. On the left, we see a bunch of pottery. Now, there's no way you could know this, but take my word for it. All these pots come from different places, and like the bottom right one is as a Canaanite jar, and then other ones were Cypriot, and as I'll show you, some are Mycenaean. They also found these scarab seals on the top right. Scarab seals are Egyptian types of seals that have a dung beetle on the back of them, and that's what a scarab is. It's that specific shape, but made out of gold here, right? And we see on the bottom there's a little plaque of of gold with a hole through the top, so it's probably worn as a pendant from a necklace, and shows the goddess Ishtar or Inanna, goddess of love, but also, as we've discussed, she's a mistress of the animals as well for the Eastern Med. But these seals are really small, and it's really impressive that they were so careful in finding these. They basically had these huge vacuums with screens in them, so they could just suck up all the dirt, and a lot of these objects like this would get preserved. And they have seals on. These seals would make sealings. Notice the one on the bottom is cut in half, so this is showing that they were used for the raw material. That's what they were being saved for. They're no longer being official. And one thing that's interesting is one dates to the 18th dynasty and to this woman, Nefertiti, and who dies in 1331 BC. So we know that this seal was made during her lifetime, but since it was no longer any good, we can presume that it was after she died, and so it would be melted down, etc. If you know anything about Egyptian archaeology, she was married to this wonderfully crazy pharaoh, Akhenaten, who you can see on the little picture on the left. He's there at his pharaoh's crown, etc. And this famous bust of her, which is in Berlin, is shown as well. And they sit down on the bottom right. He was sort of very strange looking. He broke the canons of typical Egyptian art. And he had sort of wide hips and elongated face. And there's been a lot of studies that he had some sort of certain, physical problems. But what he did in Egypt was that he sort of outlawed all the other temples except for those for the god Aton. And he said that was the only god; all the other ones were fake, and he dismissed all the clerics from the various temples and made it very unpopular. But he was our first monotheist. And the god was to the sun, Atom, and and he's sitting across from his wife Nefertiti on the right. He is shown there on the left. So we know when she reigned. She's very, very famous, and we can see the sun's rays shining down on them. There's even little hands at the end of each ray, helpful hands, and showing approval to them. And he shows himself more naked than usual, and with these roundish hips and this sort of drooping belly. If you ever take Egypt class that I teach every once in a while, we'll talk a lot about him. He's a very fascinating emperor. In any case, the Egyptians' chronology is our safest chronology out there because of all the writing, because they kept kings lists and records of kings and how long they reigned, so we know when these things precisely would date to. Here we see this nice golden helmet here, or maybe that one might be brass, I'm not sure. But in any case, nice metal. We see the swords down here on the right, the daggers going vertical on the left. We've seen daggers like this before, like with the lion hunt dagger, where the handle is attached to it. On the right, we see a development of a new type of sword I'll come back to later on, called a Naue Type 2 sword. In which, when it's made in a mold, the handle is made as part of the sword and makes the blade much stronger, or sturdier, I should say. I'm going to talk about that in the next lecture, actually, or in the next lecture or the lecture after that, about the importance of these swords. What's also found was ivory, and not only elephant tusks, but hippo tusks. So we know that they were both used, and they were, had been cut and sold in portions, and this is where all the ivory that's used for the goods we find in Greece or Anatolia, etc. It was all coming from there, and a sign of it's wealth. Put it this way, it's a very expensive material. Now, here's an interesting part. Some Mycenaean pottery was found. Um, just take my word for it, these are Mycenaean shapes. Two on the left, the big one and the small one, are called pilgrim flasks, where they have sort of a false neck and then a spout off to the side. Then a kylix, a Mycenaean kylix in the bottom center there. And just take my word for it, these are Mycenaean vessels. But there's not tons of them. There's a lot of vessels, but only a handful of Mycenaean ones. And we think that perhaps there was just one Mycenaean trader on the boat, and that's why just one is shown in that reconstruction. That he was sort of a representative of them, of some in one way or another. And the boat seems to have had an international crew, as also shown by these three vessels. The one on the left is a Canaanite amphora, and in the middle it's a golden chalice, and on the right is a Mycenaean kylix. So three different cultures here mixed in with this one deposit. Also, seals were found. We've talked about seals before. There's this nice crystal seal, hollowed down the center, so you could put a string through that. And these two gold things on each side are what are called finials. They went on the ends, on the top and the bottom of the cylinder seal. And once again, cylinder seals are a type of seal used in the Near East. They're not Aegean seals or Egyptian seals, but showing the international nature of this vessel. And here I just want to focus on the upper left-hand ones. The one on the middle right and bottom right are not from this site. And you can see on the upper left the line of ingots, and we talked about the Nefertiti seal and this plaque of Inanna, or the mistress of the goddess, on the bottom left. But I want you to pay attention to what's on the upper right there. And this is a really interesting, spectacular find. It is a diptych. Now, a diptych is a two-sided, basically, recording little book. The words used in Homer. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But the way this works is that there's that ivory binder in the middle there, and then two pages when it opened up, and there was the wood is carved out into a square in the middle, and in there was be put wax, so you could write a message on wax, and when you no longer needed the message, you could erase it away. And the bottom, if you notice, is scored, is scraped, so the wax, when it was poured in there, could sit tight and hold tight against the wood. As we can see here, they're quite small, but enough to get the message across. When Homer mentions them, the diptych, he talks about it having magical scratches in them. And this is about the only time he talks about writing as well in the Iliad or the Odyssey. So we think that he was illiterate. There was a good chance he was illiterate because he just didn't know what these things meant, what these writings meant. And it gives you an idea of how small it is. Now here is the camp that they built on shore near the site. Now what's amazing, once again, is that the boat is not far away from the shore, but it's quite deep. So this is a real dangerous part of the coast, and so it must have run up against the rocks and then sunk very, very deep. That's just the nature of the landscape here, and to show that this was a dangerous area. Less than 2 years ago, another site was found right near it, which we call the Antalya shipwreck, because Antalya is the closest city to the shipwreck, but it's not far away from the Kos shipwreck. So this seems to be a dangerous place, put it that way. This only preliminarily been published, not everything, mostly just what they've found, and took pictures of the bottom. I hope they're continuing to excavate, but I haven't heard anything since a year and a half ago. This last summer I asked around, but nobody knew anything other than the initial publication. And you can see the ingot in the center of the bottom right image there, and then other images of them pasting together a bunch of photos to reconstruct the whole boat. And here's another shot of it. It's sloping down a hill there, but in the middle you can see there's a bunch of ingots and other finds. And here's a distribution of them, and all the green ones there are ingots. And once again, it sort of preserves the shape of the boat for us. These are being held as ballast. So once again, a lot of money lost when this baby sank. And here's one of the ingots at the bottom. Notice that it, though it's close to the oxhide shape, it's not completely. The handles are gone. On this one, it could be a style. It could be that they're broken off. But as I'll show you in a little bit, there's a style where they make them without the handles, but it would make them much harder to carry. Once again, we got these bun ingots, these round ones here, and we saw them for glass, and they were used for other things, including tin, which is rarely preserved for us. And so it shows that they labeled all these and photographed them, but I don't know if any of them have been lifted off the ocean floor yet. But there are styles of ingots, and they too can show some where their origins or when they were made. We can see George Bass was obviously quite interested in them because he's been finding so many of them. But he classified these before he even found the Uluburun shipwrecks, so that's very interesting indeed. These are just different ways, ingots are just different ways you can transport large amounts of precious goods. Primarily metal, but we saw glass. And here's just a wonderful shot of the site. You can see the ingots being sprawled out along the ground there. Once again, George Bass found this by showing drawings of ingots to sponge divers, because the sponge divers have to go quite deep to get the sponges. And they said they recognized this, drawn shape that George had made. But they didn't know it was anything man-made. They just, they thought it was just some crazy geology, I imagine. My point is that they'd been seen many times, but they weren't really recognized for what they were until, the last, 50 years, let's say. And here's just one more shot of them growing down, or not growing, spewed there with coral and plants growing over them. I do want to tell you, if any of you know how to scuba dive, there's a great need for archaeologists to know how to do it. They have the knowledge of archaeology, but also the skill to be a scuba diver and to go quite deep. And you'd be of great value to archaeological projects in the region. But those are the two sort of spectacular shipwrecks that have really broadened our understanding of how interconnected these empires in the late Bronze Age were. Okay, and with that, we'll go to Pylos.